I happened to speak then to one of the headhunters that I'd used regularly to bounce some ideas off him. And I said, I've thoroughly enjoyed this leadership role as a CEO, and I'm wondering what my next assignment could be in that same capacity. And he raised a very interesting question. He said, why would you want to do that? You've been doing it for 20 years. The external environment will not adapt to us and what we're trying to do. We have to adapt to the external environment, and that's outside-in thinking.
What if you turn hardship into greatness, anger into serenity? Everything changes. Make your life a masterpiece. Welcome, I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, Willie Pietersen. Willie Pietersen is Professor of the Practice of Management at the Graduate School of Business at Columbia University in the city of New York, and joins me now to discuss his stellar book, Leadership: The Inside Story. Have you ever wondered what real, effective, and powerful leadership entails? Why leadership can change your and other people's life, and how actually start your journey to an outstanding life and success in general? If you're interested, join me now. Welcome, Professor Willie Pietersen, to the show. It's such an honor to have you back.
Thank you very much, Yannick. I look forward to our discussion.
And I have to mention for everyone who is listening is that we actually do this the second time. And Professor Willie Pietersen is so kind, and actually he takes again time because unfortunately we had a problem, a technical issue, and I wasn't able to solve it, and therefore he was agreeing to come back, which I'm truly grateful for your time. Thank you so much, Willie Pietersen. So before we really start, first and foremost, how about you introduce yourself in simply one powerful sentence?
Okay. Born and raised in South Africa. And my first activity after graduating from law school was as a legal practitioner in Cape Town. Subsequently, I entered into the corporate world and had an international business career, starting with Unilever and then subsequently with other companies in a number of countries around the world, and was a CEO for a period of 20 years. And I'm now a professor at Columbia Business School, and I've been doing this particular role for the last 28 years, actually longer than any other activities I've done. But all the elements of my career seem to have built on each other in some kind of a rich, progressive system. And I'm very grateful for this wonderful learning laboratory that I've had throughout my life.
And it's really powerful, really, the background that you bring with 5 years of practicing law in South Africa, then being a CEO for multi-billion-dollar companies for 20 years, and then now it's really your 27th year of being a professor at one of the most important business schools in the world. So it's really exciting. So what do you think was it that brought you into business, and more specifically into the world of leadership?
Well, an interesting thing about practicing law is that you're confined by your jurisdiction. You can't move to different countries unless you write their particular law exams to do so. We were living in South Africa at the time of the apartheid regime, which was repulsive and unacceptable to us as a family, to my wife and me at the time. This is before we had kids, and we decided we did not want to raise a family in South Africa. And I needed to find an avenue, a career that would enable me to have an international career. I'd always been interested in corporate and leadership, in business strategy. So I had an opportunity to join Unilever and became lucky enough to land a job with Unilever, first of all in South Africa, and then, in line with my wishes and my hopes, had international assignments in various countries. So I enjoyed the role of corporate leadership a great deal. I learned a lot from it. Kind of an action learning system. Lots of challenges along the way, working in different cultures, different countries, and different kinds of businesses. As I say, this was a wonderful learning laboratory. After 20 years of running businesses, I was running a business entity which was a subsidiary of Kodak, and Kodak was beginning to fail. It subsequently went insolvent, and as part of its attempt to rescue itself and generate cash, it asked us in New York, Kodak was based in Rochester, upstate New York, asked us to sell the business to raise cash for Kodak. Well, we succeeded in selling the business successfully, and that left me without a job. I happened to speak then to one of the headhunters that I'd used regularly to bounce some ideas off him. And I said, I've thoroughly enjoyed this leadership role as a CEO, and I'm wondering what my next assignment could be in that same capacity. And he raised a very interesting question. He said, why would you want to do that? You've been doing it for 20 years. You often talk about being a lifelong learner. You often talk about teaching, that a key part of being a CEO is to teach others how to think about the business, what the key issues are, etc., to think strategically, to think about leadership in systematic and useful ways. So why don't you go and teach? And I thought, well, that's a nice abstract question, but how do I just snap my fingers and do that? But then I remembered something. And this is where serendipity plays a role in one's life. The dean at Columbia Business School, a guy called Mayer Feldberg, some years before, had visited us when I was heading up Seagram's liquor business in the US on a fundraising lunch. And during the lunch, he said to me, Willie, we like to have corporate executives come to Columbia on weekends and teach a case study for our executive MBAs. Would you be up to doing that? I said, sure, that sounds like fun. And I did it a few times. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And so I suddenly thought, well, why don't I call up Mayer Feldberg? If I was just somebody off the street calling him up, it would have been difficult to gain access, no doubt. But I reminded him that I'd done this some years prior, and I said, could I come and have a cup of coffee with you? Which we did. And I said, I've done this here on those weekends, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And he opened up a drawer on the top left-hand side. I remember it vividly, pulled out a file. And he said, yeah, I have your evaluations here. And they were pretty decent. So would you like to come aboard and do this? So I said, okay, terrific. Now, at that stage, I didn't have a formal appointment as a professor. There is a designation at the school, and I think most of the business schools, most of the professional schools, including the medical schools, have this designation of professor of the practice. And that is based on one's practitioner background experience, ability to learn, do research, and provide evidence-based concepts. So I said, certainly I'll have a go at this. He said, I'd like you to meet some faculty members who can give you some guidance on how to navigate this new world. You're now doing something totally different. It's not just going to happen by accident. You're going to have to learn your way to success. I said, yeah, I'd love to do that. So we had a roundtable discussion. And I remember one of the faculty members, a guy called Mac Hulbert, who was in the marketing division at the business school. He was one of these very blunt, straight-shooting guys with no frills. And he said, you want advice from me? I said, of course. I'd love some advice and guidance. He said, well, let me tell you the truth. 80% of corporate executives who come in here and think they can teach end up failing. I said, oh, wow, that's not good news, but give me advice. Why do they fail? How can I avoid failing in that way? Help me do this. And he gave a few ideas, but the main idea I pulled out of that discussion was that the hazard, I think, of coming from the corporate world, even when you get a good appointment to teach, is thinking that your own cocoon of experience represents the whole world of knowledge about leadership or strategy. It doesn't. It's just a point of evidence. That's my life, my experience. And I realized that I needed to validate whatever thought, concepts, frameworks I came up with evidence from the external world, validate what I was offering. I found that was fun. It's called secondary research, not doing original research, but looking at what's going on around the world. Why did Kodak go insolvent? Why did General Motors, we forget about this, General Motors went insolvent, was rescued by the US government. What made Apple such a brilliant success? What was Jobs' secret in turning Apple around? Yes, I have some examples from my own experience, but I'm finding now that most of my kind of evidence that I bring to the table are from these external sources. It's worked pretty well. So after 3 years of doing this, the tenured faculty vote for this kind of appointment, and I was very lucky. They voted to appoint me to the professorship, and I've been enjoying that immensely ever since that time.
What do you think made you set apart from the crowd? As you just mentioned, 80% of people who join the school, they actually fail. So what sets you apart from others? And why do you think is that? And also, can you decipher or point to something in your childhood, whether it's your parents or someone else who was a truly inspiration that ultimately instilled in you a certain way of being, asking question, as you just were asking, right? You asked him, okay, I want to learn, what do you think should I do, and so on and so forth, because it takes also courage asking questions. So where does this come from? What really set you apart? What do you think?
Well, I don't want to set myself up as above anybody else because I'm not.
You're very
However,
humble, of course. I mean, you're very humble. You're an amazing, and that's why I just everyone who is listening, please go on Rivertown's books and really order a copy of Leadership: The Inside Story. It's really powerful. So just please keep going.
well, we're all different. We all bring something distinctive to the table. And what we bring to the table needs to fit the needs and expectations of those we seek to serve. And that's the magic, where you connect directly and in a way intimately with real empathy and tune in to what's in the minds of others and seek to help them address those issues. Sometimes you raise issues that they may not have thought about. But my starting point always is to tune in to my audience. And often I start with a little quiz. and say, what's truly important amongst these various things in the roles that you exercise? What would you most like to address here that will help you do this better? And then I write down a little agenda and say, what's important here is not my agenda, it's yours. This is not for me, this is for you. And I think this is really the first order of business. And the second is, I think teaching is the wrong word. The right word is learning. And what we're doing is learning together. I don't know everything. Nobody can know everything. And what we need also to be able to do is when you get posed lots of questions and people think, well, if you're a professor, you probably are all knowing in some kind of way, is to learn to say, I don't know. When you don't know, don't pretend. If you don't know, say so. People suss it out immediately when you start making things up as you go along, right? And that's an insult to your audience. But that's an opportunity for collective learning. So saying I don't know is not enough. It's how do we discover the truth here together? I'm a great fan of philosophy. I read philosophy very widely. I think that's very informative in terms of leading a rich life and being an effective leader. And philosophy, if you distill it, helps us discover the right answers to three big questions that we're always confronted with in our lives. One, what's true? Second, what's important? And third, what's right? And I think as we approach any problem or any issue, whether we're deliberate or intentional about it, it involves that process. What's true is the first order of business. And it was Nietzsche, the German philosopher, who said, the truth doesn't lie in facts, it lies in interpretation. So the skill of interpreting, we've got myriads of facts, data. Data is not truth. Data is the raw material from which we discover truth. And that's an interpretive process. So what's true is a hard enough task. Lots of things are true, but what's truly important? If you're making a really big decision, you've got to separate the important from the unimportant. And then finally, what's right? The easy decisions are between right and wrong. And our teenage kids can do that. The tough decisions are between right and right. And then we go back to what's important. And that is where our values and our principles come into play. We discover what's important in life by anchoring our thinking to our critical values. And these need to be explicit. We need to live them day by day. It's what Marcus Aurelius, the Roman philosopher, called our command center. And every effective leader that I've observed has a very clear command center that represents the principles that will determine their actions and inspire others and provide authenticity and visibility and transparency. So, that's a bit the way I approach this learning process. And it's a collective endeavor. It's not a one-way street. Now, you asked about my childhood. And that's an interesting thing. We're all a product of our environment, and a factor that often determines who we are comes from our early formative years. My mother, for example, had an enormous amount of curiosity. It's what I call energetic curiosity. There's idle curiosity, which is, I wonder why. Energetic curiosity, he says, I wonder why this happens, or I wonder why that's true, and then keep pursuing the answers. That's energetic curiosity. And she had that curiosity about her and was constantly challenging me a little bit sort of ahead of my years to say, I want to tell you about something. And I want you to remember this as you think about leading your life going forward. She would talk about, with a little example, she would talk about the importance of kindness. And then, we had a discussion one day. I remember that she said, this is what democracy is all about. If you think about its fundamental principles, it's about fairness and about kindness. And if those things disappear, so does our democracy. Now, these kinds of discussions, questions that are probing and provocative, leads to an attitude that prevails throughout our lives, right? So, yeah, a bit about now. The other thing, I was infected by curiosity by my mother. I put it that way. Now, the other thing from my early life that I will mention is that in my bedroom, in front of my bed, on the wall, was a map of the world. And in the mornings, the sun would shine through the window and shine directly onto this world map. I became acutely aware of the fact that I was living at the southern tip of Africa in a smallish town called East London, and had no clue and no experience about the rest of the world and all the different cultures. One day I put a pin into the map where I was living in this small town at the tip of Africa. And I began to form a resolve that I was not going to remain pinned down in this small place for the rest of my life without experiencing what the whole world had to offer. I had this immense curiosity. And I made a resolve, even at that stage of my life, which I discussed with my parents quite a bit, that I would like to experience the whole wide world in this one opportunity that we have to be alive in this short period of time. That yearning, that desire never went away. And I think one of the greatest joys I had as a CEO was the opportunity to work with people in different cultures, in Thailand, in Russia, in Japan, in Brazil. So in various countries like that across all of the regions of the world. I learned a great deal about it, about different cultures. I learned a great deal about being non-judgmental. We all go to a different culture and look at what they do, their patterns of behavior, and wonder quietly to ourselves why they don't behave like we do, thinking that our culture should be the one that dominates how they do things. And you quickly learn to respect the way others choose to live their lives. So, there is that kind of element throughout my life of exploration, curiosity, discovery, and doing this in an interactive way with others to enrich our thinking.
Before we dive into the book, how did you cope with the stress and pressure as a CEO? Because that is something that is really serious. How did you cope with it throughout these 20 years?
I don't think I was a champion at coping with it. You run into periods of time of very intense pressure and activity with too many things on your plate. And you quickly realize that you're going to drown unless you understand two things. One is the ability to delegate. And the second is to give yourself enough breathing space to make quality decisions. Because if you're too busy and too stressed, you're going to make very poor decisions. I've been a walker. I walk every day. I've done this as a practice throughout my entire career. And I never miss a day, only if it's raining. Sometimes if it's snowing, fine, just keep going. But I walk every day, every morning. So my habit as a corporate executive, when I worked in New York City, was to walk for 30 minutes through a pathway that I picked through Central Park every single day before I arrived at the office, unless it was raining. those were the days. I had a driver called Joe, and Joe was, was a bit of a nanny to me. Sometimes he'd say, "Oh, Mr. Pietersen, it's very windy today, or it's very cold today. Not a good day for walking." And I said, "Joe, if I keep making excuses, I'll never walk." And so I discovered something that was since validated scientifically, that walking conveys and provides tremendous benefits. There's a chemical called BDNF that gets released that activates and nourishes our neurons, and that promotes creative thinking. And endorphins that create a sense of calmness. And of course, you're getting aerobic exercise at the same time, so it's physically a sound thing to do. And I found that this was a creative exercise, much as anything else. That sometimes I would walk and think, well, I better make a speech tonight, for example. Somebody's retiring and I better formulate my ideas. After about 3 or 4 minutes, that would disappear from my mind. And completely uninvited would come a creative idea to solve a problem that had been festering for a while, that had kind of confounded us as a team. And this creative process, you suddenly found, here's a solution to it. I was very excited by that process. People began to tease me. I remember going to Australia at one stage as a CEO to visit the local subsidiary. I loved walking in their botanical gardens in Sydney and did that every day. And I said, this I do first. Before we start our day, I do this first. They said, fine. So I arrived there on the second day, and we'd been discussing a particular problem. And I said, by the way, I had a thought. Why don't we approach the problem this way? And they looked at me and they said, aha, you've been for your walk, haven't you? So that's a discovery. Now, since that time, I've looked at the evidence. And a lot of the major discoveries in the world happened through people when they went on a walk. I'll give you one example. Nikola Tesla. Here I'm talking about the invention and application of electricity. Thomas Edison is credited, apart from the light bulb, which he invented, is credited with inventing electricity and its transmission. Well, what he actually pioneered was what we called direct current. And the problem with direct current is that you need numerous substations to regenerate electricity because it cannot travel long distances. And Nikola Tesla battled for years, literally, in his laboratory to find a way of generating electricity in long distances. He got a lot of support financially to do his experiments. They all failed, and eventually this support dried up, the financial support. And he said, well, I tried. It seems that I failed. And it was not very long after that when he went for a walk in a park in Budapest, not thinking of electricity. And the solution flew into his head of alternating current, which is now the system we all use to generate electricity at long distances. And then rushed out, of course, to formulate this solution. How did he discover it? Well, he worked very hard at battling away, first of all, but he literally discovered the solution during a walk. So I'm not alone. There are many other, I quote a number of examples in my book of this. So it's something I urge as a means of refreshing, of pausing, of withdrawing from your everyday intense activities, doing something different and allowing a bit of breathing space to occur in your mindset and in your way of thinking. And at the same time, giving your body the opportunity for some aerobic exercise. I like to walk at that stage quite briskly. So that's one technique I learned, and I still walk every day. I don't walk as far or as fast. That doesn't matter. I do what I can, and I walk every day. So I advocate that very strongly. And I found that was a kind of a release valve at the same time. What you're discussing is coping with pressure. And the secret, I think, coping with pressure, don't keep hammering away when you're under pressure, unless, like John Kennedy was facing, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you can't say, well, we got the luxury of time. And there he had to use a different technique, which is don't try and do it yourself. If it's really complex, get diverse perspectives, and then sift through those ideas and make your decision. But if it's if the house is not burning down and the bombs are not going to be dropped within 10 minutes, use this opportunity as much as you can, even during a lunch hour. That's another thing. I used to take a second walk sometimes, have a sandwich, and then go for a 10-minute walk, amble around New York City, come back into the office, refreshed.
Thank you so much for sharing this. So, what do you think are the three domains of leadership that you elaborate in your book, and how did you come about these three pillars?
I began to think about leadership more and more deeply and discovered a lot of insight through my reading, somewhat through business books. But to be honest, maybe 20% of the books I read are business books. But I think we learn when we broaden our lens, and I learn from philosophy, from evolutionary science, and from astrophysics. And we broaden our lens that way. And I began to see through these various reading hobbies, if you like, that leadership exists in various settings. It's universal. So it exists, for example, at a national level. We talk about our political leaders, the head of the country, the president or prime minister or chancellor. There's military leadership. That's the job of the generals. There's organizational leadership, which I was involved in as a CEO. There's community leadership. You can be a coach to your kids' baseball team. You can volunteer and do various things. You're making a difference. And it exists at the family level. If you've got a spouse, if you've got kids, or if you've got grandkids like I do, or if you're taking care of an older member of the family who's faltering, that's leadership too. And the interesting thing about it is it's universal. And sometimes, we forget that. And we at the office, I was a CEO, and then I go home. I'm not a CEO when I go home, and I was reminded of that quite a bit. You're not a CEO now, but you're doing a leadership role in your family setting, whether you realize it intentionally or not. And it's a bit like, when you're driving a car and pedestrians are crossing the road without looking, you think, oh, those idiots, those pedestrians. And then you get out of your car and you're a pedestrian and they think you're the idiot. So we're both. And it's important to recognize that leadership is universal and to think intentionally about that. So that was the first kind of insight I had about leadership being a universal requirement. And that's why you don't just find it in business books. The principles of effective leadership are in and of themselves universal. The question is, how do we discover them? For me, it starts with understanding the task. What's the task of a leader? And then we work from the task to say, what are the ingredients that succeed in achieving that task? And here I came from, the idea came from a book on psychology, a guy called Howard Gardner, psychologist at Harvard. Great at psychology. He is a real expert. But sitting in the middle of a book on psychology, was this definition of leadership, and I wrote it down immediately. I keep a learning journal, and it goes as follows. A leader is somebody who is able, through persuasion and personal example, to change the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of those they seek to lead. Now, for me, that's a very powerful definition. That's the task. And I take note of the fact that leaders who just try and change other people's behaviors without changing their thoughts and feelings might get compliance, but will never get commitment. And the whole world of success, I think leadership resides in that gap between compliance and commitment. So I like that definition a lot. And for me, it's kind of a starting point. So that's the task. And then I thought about what's the starting point? You know, whenever you learn anything, even playing golf, you say, where do I begin, right? What do I do first? And there I drew inspiration from Confucius, who said to be a leader, you must first be a human being. This is about authenticity. And from there was born a concept of leadership consisting of 3 interrelated domains. And working these in combination, because they're interdependent, is a holistic approach to leadership, cutting across all of these settings of leadership that I've described. And I think is a very useful way to think systematically on how to be a leader and how to continuously learn to do it better. Those 3 domains start with personal leadership. Thank you, Confucius. Personal leadership, and that's Marcus Aurelius's idea of your command center, is first of all to determine clearly, explicitly, intentionally, the key principles according to which you will choose your actions and which will inspire others. This gives you this transparency and authenticity that is the threshold requirement for all effective leadership. Second domain of leadership is strategic leadership, the ability to set a clear direction for an organization, to create unity of action, a winning way, and a clear set of shared priorities. You can't lead without the ability to do that. And the third domain of leadership is interpersonal leadership, which is bringing out the best in others. Now, when you begin to think about that, you realize that you, as a leader, regardless of your role of seniority, we all lead from the middle, etc. Is you begin to realize that this is a great way to think about leadership and to improve your own performance because you're systematic about it, and a great way to get feedback from others. Rather than saying to people who you trust to give you feedback, how am I doing, which is what Ed Koch, the previous mayor of New York, used to walk around the streets and say, how am I doing? I always used to think it's the wrong question. You should ask them, how are you doing? But nevertheless, it was always, how am I doing? But when you ask for feedback, always find a truth teller to give you feedback. You must have truth tellers in your life. It's now much easier to say, how am I doing at personal leadership? How am I doing at strategic? How am I doing at interpersonal leadership? And that's where you get much richer feedback because you've got a structure that enables people to give you that kind of feedback that's useful. Because leadership effectiveness is a continuous journey where we lead our way, learn our way to success as the environment shifts and new challenges emerge.
When you started in your very first role in South Africa as a CEO of a unit of Unilever, you tell a very telling story about the first couple of months. So, walk us through what your boss actually asked you about your first couple of months as a CEO.
Sure. Well, the first thing to say is I was appointed rather young to this new role, running a subsidiary of Unilever, their foods business in South Africa. A business of considerable size in that setting in South Africa. At the time, I was told, "Oh, you're amongst the youngest ever given this kind of responsibility." So, well, that's a bit scary because I know everybody's watching. I wonder whether he'll make it. So I had thought a lot about business as I went up through the ranks. I'd only been with Unilever 6 years by the time they appointed me to a CEO position. I had practiced law prior to that. I enjoyed practicing law, although it is a bit confining in many ways, because of its mental disciplines. Its need to be disciplined in terms of critical thinking, objectivity, the pursuit of truth, logic. So I thought, well, if I bring those skills to my leadership role, that will be my formula for success. If I can really establish the logic that will drive success, if I can explain the logic to everybody else, that will galvanize them, because logic wins everything. Galvanize them and inspire them to pursue that logic. Well, of course, the world doesn't work that way. Logic will take you only so far. Well, I like to say there's the logic and there's the magic. The magic is really tuning into others, inspiring them, and leading them onwards towards that with a kind of commitment to success that comes from Howard Gardner's formulation. Sorry about these sounds in the background. They're what I call the sounds of New York City, right? Howard Gardner's formulation, I think, tells us you're always a teacher as a leader, helping people to think in the right ways, and then encourage their feelings of commitment and excitement and inspiration, and then their correct behaviors will follow. Okay, so that's the formula. Now, I'd followed this process of logic, thinking about it as a chess game, right? Move all the pieces in the right way, and explain it to everybody, and they will understand. So C.J. van Jaarsveld, who was the chairman of the group and my boss, was really a wonderful guy. He'd been in the World War II, leading his troops fearlessly in battle as a commander of some kind. I think he was in Burma. So he was a straight shooting guy. And then underneath the straight shooting was a great deal of understanding and empathy, kindness, if you like. It's why I sometimes have a formula today when I teach that says hard on issues and soft on people. Now, CJ was hard on issues and soft on people. He called me up after 3 months and said, "Pietersen, come in here and let's have a chat." I went to his office and he said, "Okay, tell me what surprised you in your first 3 months in this role, your first role as a CEO." And I said, "I tell you what really has surprised me is how much time I have needed to spend on human issues of motivation, of inspiration, of communication, of caring about people's needs and their careers and nurturing their development." I said, that has absorbed more than 50% of my time. That's been a surprise. Not that it's necessary, but I thought there was an element that would follow the logic. And he literally, instead of giving me a lecture, he just smiled because I had discovered something for myself. And he simply said, Pietersen, welcome to leadership. So I think we need to welcome ourselves to leadership that way. You know, by developing ourselves, by being thoughtful of it. It's a really interesting challenge because I gave you those 3 domains of leadership. If you step back and think about those 3 domains, you're running 2 systems. You're running an operating system. That's the managerial task. And you're managing, excuse me, a social system. That's the leadership task. So as I've said, forgive me, I get allergies. As I've said at the outset, leadership is about tasks. I'm sorry, management is about tasks. And you need to have the right tasks, but they're done through people. And leadership is about people. And that's where it all begins. You can delegate the tasks, and you should be good at delegating the tasks. You cannot delegate leadership. You own it. The leadership is you. Cannot delegate it.
Is this part why you are so into business, because of the aspect of these human relationship, even though it doesn't really seem that this was your initial, what really drove you into business, but is this the part, the relationship part, the human relationship part, that you really got even more inspired in terms of business? And do you think that business is as much numbers as it is relationships or building relationships?
What gives leadership meaning? Forgive me. If you just think about the tasks, those are kind of ritualistic, sort of antiseptic. If you realize that the real contribution is making a difference to the lives of others, a positive difference. Hitler made a difference, but it was not a positive one. It's about making a positive difference to the lives of others. That's what gives meaning to our lives in the various settings that we exercise leadership in. And without that dimension, it would be a pretty arid existence.
Do you think business is one of the best ways in which you can really expand your leadership in a positive way?
It's one avenue. I think teaching, as I've discovered, is another avenue. I think the hardest leadership challenge is parenting. Now, at my stage in life, I've got young grandkids. And as a kind of a patriarchal figure, I know they're watching me. And I know they're taking cues from my example of how I deal with others, whether I'm kind and considerate, whether I become impatient very quickly, how I deal with difficult issues, try and unravel them and think about, those 3 questions: what's true, what's important, what's right. And we have a number of discussions. They come down. I have a home in Florida, and they come down quite often for a few weeks at a time during school vacations. The twins of 11 years old and a youngster of 7. And I developed a little game that we play at breakfast time every morning. It started when I constructed a set of behavioral ideas for the day, thought for the day, kindness, courtesy, consideration, helpfulness, whatever it is, and saying, well, each of you is going to get a turn every day to pick one of these that we will live by as a family all day long and remind each other. And they began to really enjoy this. It became a kind of my turn to pick a word, to pick the word for the day. But the magic of that, I subtly put in, these are values, not just things that don't mean anything, is how much they enjoyed it because they were involved in choosing, and how much they enjoyed reminding each other. Sitting at the back of the car, for example, they'd get into a little bit of an argument, and one would say, we meant to exercise kindness today. What are you doing? Why aren't you listening to me in a nice, sympathetic way? And I would then encourage them along those lines. Now, at an everyday level, that's an enjoyable thing to do. But given the influence that it has on the lives of others, that's a leadership task. It's just a means of leading the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of others in a positive kind of way. So I find that extremely meaningful. I find it meaningful in the teaching role as well. How often it has happened, and that's for me, very gratifying. How often it's happened that people have come to me after a 3 or 5 day program on leadership and strategy, come up to me and said, you've really made a difference to my understanding of things and to my ability to embark on lifelong learning and improve myself through time. So I think the most important thing we can do as a teacher is to imbue the desire for lifelong learning, because that's what it takes to succeed in life. The environment won't stop changing. We dare not stop learning, and we dare not stop helping others to learn as well. So that's the gratifying part. And it comes back to what you've just been emphasizing, that it's not the task here that I'm talking about. It's the difference it makes to individual human beings. And that's the gratifying part of teaching. The great hidden secret that Mac Hulbert didn't reveal to me in that conversation when he said 80% fail. The secret he didn't reveal, but I've since discovered, is teaching is the most effective way ever invented to learn.
And I love that, because you say that if you want to have a successful business, you want to do successful leadership, or you want to do a successful life, you have to learn how to learn. And I really appreciate also your definition, because for you, learning is really when there is a change in behavior. So how can we start within ourselves, but then also within an organization, to learn how to learn? And why do you think learning is so critical, especially given the fact that our environment is constantly changing?
Well, I'll give you my thoughts on this, not that I can give a magic bullet. First of all, make your inquiries wide-ranging. I've mentioned philosophy and the things I've learned from philosophy. What I've learned from evolutionary science is the need to create adaptive organizations in the face of ongoing change, and that evolutionary science, Charles Darwin reminded us that the external environment will not adapt to us and what we're trying to do. We have to adapt to the external environment, and that's outside-in thinking. I learned that from evolutionary science. And I often, when I mention that, I say to the people in my seminar, sometimes we have freedom of choice. Sometimes we have rules. Gravity is a rule. You can't throw a ball in the air and say, well, I've decided it'll stay up there. Evolutionary science is the same thing. We can't change it. It's a rule. You have to live within those rules and adapt accordingly. I learned that from evolutionary science. I've learned a lot from astrophysics. More and more, there are books now that are easily understandable for lay people like me. I don't like an explanation that consists of an equation with symbols. I don't know what they mean. That the physicists learn that way. I learn from words and ideas. Great books that you can discover. And it is what it's taught me is humility, the understanding of our own insignificance in the scale of the vast universe. There are more stars in our galaxy than all the grains of sand in all the beaches in the world. The scale is immense. Everything in the universe is transient, and so are we. And in the scale of the timelines in the universe, our lives are very, very short, tiny little blips in the scale of time. But this sends us a reminder that we have just enough time to make a difference. And that, for me, that's the important thing of what are we going to do with our little blip, the luck that we have for this existence. And that's the way I just happen to think about it.
Do you
Well, I'm
think,
sorry, on this one, I want to quote Ray Bradbury, if I may, Yannick. Sorry to interrupt.
please?
Because he captures for me what thinking about the universe and all of its scale and mystery teaches us, because he, and I'm quoting him here by memory, we are born to witness the wonders of the universe and to understand who we are, where we fit in, and how to live our lives. And I think he really captured the whole idea. Read about astrophysics is what I would urge you to do. So this thing about how do we become lifelong learners? First of all, read broadly. Don't just, adopt a tunnel of learning. Read broadly. Keep a learning journal. We don't remember everything. If you come across a real gem of knowledge, of wisdom, write it down. Keep a learning journal. I've done it since I was 16 years old. I've got a pile of learning journals now on that shelf right there. I've written 3 books. Every time I've written a new book, I open up all my learning journals and go through them. I chuckle at the things I wrote down when I was 20 or 25 years old. A bit naive and so on. And, the insights have become richer along the way. Otherwise, we forget. So those are just 2 things that make learning intentional. There is a certain amount of learning when you go for a walk or whatever the case might be that just enters your head without being invited. But we have to exercise a lot of invitations in our lives to learning. And that comes from reading widely, discussing things with intelligent people, teaching, keeping a learning journal. And for me, that's the joy of life. I have a little mantra now in my senior years, consisting of 3 imperatives. One is never retire. Second one is never stop learning. And the third is lead life at a reasonable pace. And if you can't do the third one, you'll never achieve the first 2. And the third one is actually the toughest one to pull off.
This is also why I think you are still teaching, right? Because it's truly your purpose. So, how do you feel when you contemplate your life? Do you think you were lucky, or you were rather you made you built your luck? In other words, luck, is it something that just happened to you by mere chance, or is it more that you actually worked for your luck?
I think it's both. Sometimes we just get lucky without doing anything. But that's not the way we should live, of expecting luck to visit us. It doesn't often happen that way, like a bolt out of the blue sky. Luck takes preparation. And the more we explore, the luckier we get. I think that's probably true. Often I hear people say, well, I tried this and tried that and tried the next thing, and then I got lucky. Well, no. If you hadn't tried all those other things, you wouldn't have got lucky. The scientific method starts with an hypothesis and then a set of experiments to see if the hypothesis is correct. Most of the experiments fail. And then what's left over very often is, okay, this is where the truth lies. That's not luck. That's preparation.
I so agree with you that everything we do ultimately is, as you mentioned, it has really so much more to do with intentions. And the more we do, the more chances we give ourselves to actually succeed. In other words, there is a book called The Luck Factor, and it really shows actually scientifically that luck is more created than actually by chance. There is so many things that you can actually exemplify, and one is, and this quality I think you just embody is curiosity, right? You are someone who is curious, who constantly, and that's also the scientific method. By first and foremost, we start by observing, right? We observe and then we imitate, but then also very importantly, we start asking question. And you powerfully write about how to do and formulate the right questions, but it's actually also a skill. So, how do you develop the skill of asking the right questions?
Well, it starts with an understanding that everything we know in the world, in science or in general knowledge, comes from a question somebody asked. It always starts with a question. And define a challenge, and then you pursue and you try and find the answer that way. Sometimes we have a set of embedded beliefs that come from our prior experience in life and lead to a confirmation bias. And I think then we have to be very careful. And what I often say is be very careful about ideas without great questions in front of them. Make sure you understand the questions that you're seeking to ask and to seek an answer to. Einstein came up with his theory of relativity and then his general theory. Special theory was E equals mc squared. He didn't come across that theory by sitting in a corner playing his violin. It came from a set of questions he posed. And then ultimately, as he pursued them over and over with mind experiments and so on, he arrived at this formulation. But it was kind of how do we get to understand these relative things of time and space? And he came up with a formula, which is huge intellectual breakthrough. I have the list of questions that Darwin started with when he wrote Origin of Species. He didn't just sit down and say, well, I'm going to start writing a book. He posed a series of very, very penetrating questions that built on each other. And when I look at that series of questions, I think, wow, if we got really good answers to those questions, it would be a great leap forward in our understanding of the world. And his book provides those answers to those questions. So we have to develop this skill. We owe a debt of gratitude to Socrates. Prior to Socrates, there were the sophists in Greece who taught the art of rhetoric, the art of making brilliant speeches that dazzled your audience because it displayed your brilliance. And Socrates looked at that and said, well, I don't learn anything from repeating what I already know. And my audience learns very little from what's pushed at them without their participation. His mother was a midwife, and he looked at her profession as a metaphor. He realized that she didn't give birth to babies, but she facilitated their delivery. And he said, oh, I don't give birth to ideas. I facilitate their delivery. And the means of facilitation is through questions. And, it's again like energetic curiosity. just asking a question and getting an answer without following up and digging deeper is not what, breakthroughs consist of. They consist of this kind of constant questioning, probing, finding answers that go deeper and deeper until we find out what's true, what's important, and what's right.
And this, as you just laid out, requires focus, right? Because first and foremost, you have to do the work that you just laid out. You have to actually be able to draw and put some priorities forward, some questions, and they have to come from somewhere, right? And therefore, you have to actually know from where you're coming from. And this, in and of itself, is already hard work. And so, to me, focus is really so important, because you can only have focus if you start really putting your time in something, right? Because then you can also monitor that you're making progress, right? But then at the same time, you are also able to break through the complexity that you face, because life cannot be created. It's really complexity, right? There's so many variables. How do you, especially in terms of business, but also in terms of leadership and in terms of dealing with people, how do we cut through this complexity, especially in such a fast changing world, and to be able to simplify it in a way that you can start executing?
You've posed a very difficult question, Yannick, and it's illustrative as well, because we need to answer that question. And not just, I wonder how we do this, but to arrive at a formulation in your own mind. The reality is that the world is not only moving faster and faster, but it's becoming more and more complex and difficult to make, enduring decisions in, because it's shifting so fast. I'm just thinking of the world of AI, for example. How do we think about that systematically? How do we simplify the task? I think an overarching responsibility of leaders is the ability to simplify complexity. In a world of increasing complexity, we need to find increasing simplicity. Find the core of an issue. Use metaphors. Use examples. Use pictures to illustrate things. Just using words that are complicated, etc., doesn't do it. And the more you search for a metaphor in the way that Socrates did, I don't give birth to ideas, I facilitate their delivery. And so, well, okay, that's a breakthrough idea there, isn't it? Otherwise, you're back to the art of rhetoric again from the sophists. And you need to practice intellectual humility, being more interested in what's true than in being right. So pursuing this, but I totally agree with you. There are two really tough tasks that I think are becoming increasingly difficult in our complex world. The first is the ability to simplify complexity. And as Einstein actually pointed out, if you can't truly simplify something, then you don't really understand it. That's a test of understanding. And that's a pursuit. And never leave it on the basis that people in the rank and file of your organization are saying, what does that mean? I don't know what am I supposed to do on Monday morning? And if you can't really translate that in tangible terms to each person and each function in an organization, this is what it means for your job and what you do every day as you lead your people and your function. If you're operating at above that level, you've paralyzed the organization. They won't know what to do. How do they think about profitability? They think, well, that's a complicated thing. Well, it's not actually. There are only three moving parts in any organization. There's a numerator that drives revenue, and then there's a denominator with costs and assets. And only two ways ever invented in the history of business to make money is to make the number on the right-hand side bigger, which is by raising the numerator or reducing the denominator. And you can point out to anybody in the organization, we all have a role. Everybody here is either working on driving revenue, which means we serve customers better, or developing better asset turn, utilization of assets, or being cost effective. Everybody is touching one or more of those three moving parts. Don't get complicated. There are only three. I often draw that picture. Numerator, revenue over cost plus assets equals maximum. And you need to make the number on the right-hand side as big as possible. Now, I teach operating finance to executives today, and I use that little formula of what I call the arithmetic of business as the starting point, because all the ratios that we all want and need are derived from that little formula. Now, it took me a long time to arrive at that, sort of, because I kept digging and saying, how do I make this meaningful to everybody? And it started with this question for me. Whose job in an organization is it to make money? And I said to myself, well, it has to be everybody's job. Well, how can you explain it so that it becomes everybody's job? And it'll never become a job that they feel ownership of unless they feel, oh, wow, I can make a difference. It's dedication to a cause greater than yourself, and together with the opportunity to make a difference to the outcome. And I put this up and say, you can make a difference to this outcome. Now, let's discuss your job. What are you doing right now? Okay, I'm in this. Okay, you're part of that. That's very important. And then you go to the next person, and they collectively begin to see, okay, that's our economic engine. And we're all helping to drive it forward. So I think it's that kind of process of distilling and making it understandable and actionable. And the only way it becomes actionable is when you simplify it. And learning is only complete when it changes behavior. And the simplicity is what changes behavior, not abstract statements of principle.
When I watch sports, for example, the very best, they always look like it, they make it seem so easy, right? But by this, we really see the work that they actually put in. It might seem easy, but once we try it, it's just so hard. And that's why I appreciate your book so much, because it's so powerful and it's really digestible, even though there's so much. That's why I wrote so many pages, because there's so many avenues that you can actually go, and then ultimately combine them and integrate them, within yourself. That takes time. And I think that's oftentimes too, we have to give some grace to people, that time will be a good teacher.
And it's an ongoing journey that never stops. It's a journey without a destination. Learning is a journey without a destination. There's a number of milestones involved in learning, but then there's always changes that occur that require you to go to the next and next milestone.
What did you, where do you see the biggest challenges or mistakes that leaders do, and why businesses fail?
Well, this is where I say, well, I have a point of view. I don't claim to have absolute truth on it. What I say here comes from empirical observation and a lot from my bumping into problems myself. I would, if I were to put my finger on two things, one that we've already covered, that's the need to simplify. And alongside that is the need to prioritize. And if you can't do that very well, you cannot lead, not lead your own life. You cannot lead an organization. So that's number one. The second one is the discipline of outside-in thinking. It's an unnatural way of thinking. We are not wired to think outside in. Typically, we think inside out. We start with saying, what's our vision for success? Who cares? Outside world doesn't care what you're trying to do. They care only about what they get by way of benefits from your efforts. So you'll never persuade anybody to buy your product when you say, this is my vision, buy my product. I mean, that doesn't even add up logically, does it? So starting outside and coming inside, regardless of the issue that you're trying to solve. So when you're trying to solve a problem, don't look for the solution. Ask yourself, what process will we use to arrive at a good answer? Think process first. And I encourage you always, by way of process, to start outside. Because if your internal actions and decisions don't ultimately have an external impact, you are just treading water, and your competitors will outperform you. Now, the discipline of outside-in thinking requires forcing mechanisms, ways of thinking strategically, doing a situation analysis, which is our intelligence system that drives insight and decision-making. And I have a kind of a process called strategic learning. It's got 5 areas of inquiry. 4 of them are external. 1 is internal. It's a deliberate ratio. So unless you imbue an organization with a set of techniques as a way to think outside in, they don't do it automatically because we're not wired to do that. Now, I venture to say as an experiment, if you go into the canteen, the lunch canteen of any typical organization, and you want to join somebody at a table where they're busy having their lunch, and you sit down, I would bet 90 to 10 that they're talking about internal issues. Oh, my boss is worse than your boss. There's going to be a reorganization. Perhaps we're going to do a joint venture. This person and that person is not a good actor, etc. And if you then say, I wonder what the most important trends are in the external environment that we must take into account, they suddenly look at you and say, look, you're giving us indigestion. We're having a nice conversation here. It's not a thing that happens by itself. And so it's a learned discipline, and it's a very important one.
It's so powerful what you're mentioning because it really comes down that even life, right, and our growth is a process, and we really have to focus on the very now in order to influence in one way or another the future. And what you're laying out really is process is the goal. It's the same way of thinking it, and it's so powerful. So thank you so much for sharing this. Really, we are almost done, but I also love that you actually say usually subtract first and then multiply, and that's really comes down to simplification, right? And it's an art, and that is why this book, really everyone who is listening, really get a copy of Leadership, the Inside Story, published by River Books in 2024. I will put the link below. What if, really, I put everything you wrote down in your book into, and I internalize it and I live it to the very core? What will change or transform in my life and the people around me?
Oh, these are very good questions, and they're illustrative, if I might say so, because you're helping me to think by asking those questions. And that's a hard one to answer, which all good questions are, because there's a kind of a distillation, you say, at the end of the road. If you just internalize all of these, and they're interrelated lessons that I seek to portray, what's the difference maker? I would simply hope that if you read the book and internalize its lessons, that will create a more meaningful and richer life for you and those around you.
Lastly, What makes you truly feel alive, Willie?
I think learning does. Reading a book with a lot of epiphanies. Um, I'm not young anymore, but I continue to derive enormous joy whenever I reach that moment in a busy day where I say, okay, I've deserved the time to sit down and read and discover something new where I can learn to understand something more deeply that I understood superficially before, or learn something that I didn't ever know before. It's a very interesting thing. There was a justice of the Supreme Court in the USA called Oliver Wendell Holmes, a famous jurist. And he retired. And on his 91st birthday, FDR went to visit the old man out of respect. He found him sitting in an armchair reading Plato. And FDR said to him, what are you doing? And Holmes said, I'm improving my mind. Age 91, that's the way to go.
Professor Willie Pietersen, thank you so much for your gift truly to myself and really to the world. And I invite everyone really to go online to purchase a copy of Leadership, the Inside Story, published by River Towns Books. Thank you so much, Willie Pietersen.
Thank you, Yannick. It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed our discussion.
Willie Pietersen. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com. Meant to make you grow.